Hey, Mr. P here. In this video, we're going to talk about the nature of matter, specifically how matter is constituted, right? Like what makes up matter, what the atoms do, how the atoms interact, how the atoms come together, how molecules and compounds are created, and finish it off with a little bit of bonding specifically. So, let's jump in. Without understanding the atom, it's really hard to understand how compounds or molecules even come together in the first place. And so we're going to spend some time talking about the atom structure. The atom, by definition, is the smallest unit of matter, meaning it's the smallest unit, the smallest Lego, so to speak. It's the smallest building block. And so when you look at something that is composed of matter, which obviously is everything, the smallest unit you can extract as a whole would be the atom. Okay, and so there are a variety of atoms that constitute the entire element periodic table, but the atom is composed of three parts, and you can see in either of these diagrams that the protons and neutrons both reside in the nucleus, and the electrons reside on the outside of the nucleus around the nucleus in shells. Okay, and so let's dive in a little bit about what each of these do. The protons provide the physical properties of the atom. So the protons are the positively charged. You can see that here. Protons are positively charged. They give the atom its physical properties. And so if an atom is a gas, it's a gas because of the proton number. If it is a metal, it's a metal because of the proton number. If it is soft, it's soft because of the proton number. If it's hard because of the proton number. If it puts off a smell or an odor, it puts off the odor because of an electron or a proton number. Okay, are you getting the point? The physical properties of the atom are solely determined by the number of protons. Next to the protons within the nucleus would be the neutrons. Neutrons are neutral. Okay, they do not have, and I messed up my symbols. This should be neutral, and this should be negative. Yeah, that's a big boo-boo. Neutrons are neutrally charged, okay, so they are not charged. They just give the atom mass, and they are 100% kind of in charge of this radioactivity and the idea of isotopes. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But the protons and neutrons together reside in the nucleus, and that's what gives the atom its mass, okay? So when you see an atomic mass, that number is constituted by the number of protons and neutrons. Each of them basically have a unit of measure that is equal to 1. And so if it is a carbon atom, for instance, like this one is, okay, we can say that this is carbon. You know that it's carbon because it has 6 protons. It has 6 electrons, okay, 6 protons, 6 neutrons, therefore gives you an atomic mass of 12, and it would obviously stay neutrally charged because while we have 6 protons that are positively charged, we also have 6 electrons which are negatively charged. And so if you have 6 positives and 6 negatives, then you have a net charge of 0. Okay, but the atomic mass would be 12, and so when you hear us or me talk about carbon-12, that is the normally occurring isotope or normally occurring carbon atom. Okay, so electrons are not part of the mass because they are so small. They are not part of the nucleus. They reside on the outside in these orbitals or in these shells, and they are 100% in charge of bonding. Some bonding is going to require these electrons to actually be shuttled or transferred to another atom. Some of the bonding is going to require these electrons just share with another atom. Okay, so there's a difference between covalent and ionic bonding. We're going to get into that in a minute. But either way, regardless of the bonding, it is the electrons that are in charge of that. Okay, so atom, smallest unit of matter, composed of 3 subatomic particles. All 3 of these would be referred to as subatomic, meaning below the atom in organization. Subatomic particles. All 3 of them are subatomic particles, and all 3 have a specific place that they reside, and they all have a specific job, so to speak. So now that we've talked about atoms, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about the elements, and I'm not going to go through the periodic table. For the purposes of biology and for the purposes of honors biology, we're not going to learn the periodic table. We're not going to learn what each of these colors mean. That's chemistry. That will be next year. But I think it's really good to point out that elements, by definition, are pure substances that consist entirely of one type of atom. And I throw that in there because we are talking about atoms. Helium, for instance, is an element that consists of entirely helium atoms. Hydrogen, on the other hand, is an element that is consisting of entirely hydrogen atoms. And it doesn't matter what element we're talking about, no matter where it is on the periodic table. If you're talking nickel or copper or zinc, that element is consisting of or is built of entirely nickel or copper or zinc atoms. Okay, you cannot be a pure element, you can't be a pure substance if you're not entirely composed of one pure type of atom. Okay, now all of these elements have different properties, and I said before that it's possible to have different properties because all of the elements have different numbers of protons. They're made of different types of atoms, right? Gold is made of gold atoms. Neon is made of neon atoms. The fact that neon is a gas and gold is a metal, which is obviously solid, is dependent on the number of protons within the atoms that make up that particular element. Okay, so there are hundreds of naturally occurring chemical elements on Earth, but fewer than 20 of them are actually commonly found in living organisms. So when we talk about humans, when we talk about biology, we're talking about life, we're most of the time focusing on this group because obviously those are the 20 or the group of elements that are commonly found in living organisms. And from those 20, or within the 20 of them, about 99% of the mass of living things, like you, or a plant, or a jellyfish, or a starfish, or your cat or dog, is made up of just these 6 elements. Okay? So 99% of the mass that makes up you is composed of calcium, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. Now, I know people will say, well, what about water? Like, we are made up of 60%, 70%, some people think 90% water, right? Well, what is water? Water is hydrogen and oxygen. So, yeah, we are composed of a large portion of water, but water, when you break it down, is just a compound that is composed of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Okay, so 99% of the mass that makes up you is made up of these 6 elements. Now, there are a bunch of other elements we're going to get to briefly, but like I said, for the most part, when we get to chemistry, you'll learn more about the periodic table and what the periods mean and what the rows mean and what the columns mean and that kind of thing. Okay, so we said that 99% of the mass of living things is composed of just 6 elements, but there is obviously 1% that we left out because 99 doesn't equal 100, right? So 1%, we call these the trace elements, and it is essential, okay? 99% obviously composed of these, which these are absolutely vital. Those are absolutely essential. However, the 1% of trace elements are essential as well, and a lack of trace elements can actually stunt plant growth, and they can also damage the developing organs in unborn animals. So without the 1%, okay, most people think if I get a 99% in my class, it's good, it's fine, right? I'll survive, I'll move on, I'll pass, and yes, you will, but in life, if you are missing that 1%, you're not 100% whole or 100% nourished, then you obviously can have some stunted growth or you can have some damage to the developing organs. Okay, everything is essential, everything is important. So, isotopes, we've talked about that a little bit, but what is an isotope? An isotope, by definition, is an atom of the same element that differs in the number of neutrons. And you can see it between carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. Carbon-12 is our normal version of carbon. Okay, that is not the isotope. That is the normal version of carbon. Carbon-13 is an isotope, and carbon-14 is an isotope. What does that mean? Well, if we look at our table, you will see that carbon-12, which is our non-radioactive, it is our normal version of carbon, has 6 protons. Okay, you can see them. They're green. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 protons. Well, when you look at the carbon-13 radioactive isotope, it too has 6 protons. Okay, the number of protons didn't change. When you look at carbon-14, the number of protons didn't change. It still has 6. Okay, so did the physical properties of carbon change? No. Okay, carbon-12, carbon-13, carbon-14 are all 3 carbon atoms. They all 3 have the physical properties of carbon because they all 3 have the same number of protons. When you look at the number of electrons, and you look at this diagram, because obviously the electrons aren't shown on this nucleus diagram, but when you look at the atom, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons. Okay, so carbon-12, 6 electrons. Well, when you go to carbon-13, it too has 6 electrons. And when you go to carbon-14, it too has 6 electrons. So what does that mean? They are essentially the exact same atom, except for, obviously you can see that the nucleus is gaining mass, which means if the number of protons didn't change and the number of electrons didn't change, the number of neutrons has to change. And so when we look at carbon-12, which is our normally occurring carbon, it has 6 neutrons because that's what a normal atom has. Typically, the number of neutrons will, in a lot of cases, match the number of protons, but not always. Okay, and especially as the atom gets bigger, the number of neutrons obviously kind of gains faster than the number of protons. But in carbon's case, the number of neutrons matches the number of protons. So we have 6, 6, and 6. But when you go to carbon-13, notice there is an extra neutron. And when you go to carbon-14, there is 2 extra neutrons. Okay, what does that mean? That is the difference, because when you look at the table, that is the only difference between the isotopes of carbon, carbon-12, 13, and 14. Okay, what does that mean? When you gain neutrons, you're not gaining charge because they're neutrally charged, but when you gain neutrons, you're gaining radioactivity, and the isotopes of an atom become radioactive, which can actually benefit us within a scientific context because we can use the isotopes and we can use radioactivity and we can use radioactive decay to our advantage. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so what does it mean to be radioactive? When something is radioactive, and specifically I'm talking isotopes in this case, when an isotope is radioactive, it actually gives off energy. Okay, and the energy is in the form of radiation. We've used, and you've probably heard the idea and the term radiation for different medical therapies. We can use radiation actually to detect and kill cancer cells. We can use radiation to kill bacteria within food industries, right? We can use it in sanitation to sanitize equipment. Radioactive isotopes can actually be used as tracers to follow the movements of substances within organisms, and you can actually get pretty cool kind of thermal imaging by utilizing radioactively labeled tracers to follow the movement of substances within the organism. And in kind of a less medical context, but still scientific context, geologists can actually determine the ages of rocks and fossils by looking at radioactive material, radioactive decay, half-life, stuff like that. Okay, so there is benefit to us within our medical and scientific context, but for the purposes of this class, just know that isotopes are radioactive and that isotopes are produced by basically having more than the normal amount of neutrons. Okay, so chemical compounds. Compounds are basically just bigger groups of atoms that are formed when you have 2 or more elements. So CO2, very simple compound, right? You have a carbon atom, this would be the carbon atom, and you would have 2 oxygen atoms, CO2. Glucose, C6H12O6. You have 24 atoms that makes up this ring, and you probably know that glucose is sugar, right? And there are 24 atoms. You have 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms for a total of obviously 24 atoms. H2O, another really common compound, right? You have 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogen 3 atoms making up 1 water molecule. That is a compound. Okay? Compound is formed by the combination, or the chemical combination, the bonding of 2 or more elements in definite proportions. What does the definite proportions mean? CO2. That is a definite proportion. 2 oxygen molecules, or 2 oxygen atoms, to every 1 carbon atom makes up carbon dioxide. Okay? Here are some other compounds, and the one thing that I want to kind of focus on within this slide is that the physical and chemical properties of a compound are usually very different from those of the elements from which it is formed. And what I mean by that is when we look at an oxygen atom and when we look at hydrogen atom, the hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms are both very simple, non-reactive, I shouldn't say non-reactive. They are reactive, but they're fairly common gases, right? Hydrogen is very can be very explosive. It's flammable. Oxygen is very flammable. It can be explosive. And so when they combine, or when you combine them, it actually produces something that is very non-explosive, right? We know that liquid water is vital to life. It is not reactive at all. It is not flammable, right? In fact, we use water to put out fires. So water, which is essential to life, not flammable, not explosive, is actually produced by 2 individual gas atoms that are extremely explosive and are extremely flammable by themselves. So salt. Now that we've talked about water, we can talk about salt. This is a different compound, right? Made up of a sodium and a chlorine atom, but it's the same kind of thing. Sodium by itself is a silver-colored metal that is very soft. In fact, it's so soft that it can actually be cut with a knife and is also very reactive with water. So sodium is a soft metal that can be cut with a butter knife that is very reactive with water. And when you mix this sodium atom with a chlorine atom, which is a poisonous yellow-green gas that is highly reactive also, you get something as simple as salt, which is fundamentally vital to life in the form of one of those trace compounds that we need in our diet all the time, right? Salt is a white solid that dissolves easily in water. It is not poisonous, it is not reactive, and it is essential for survival of most living things. Okay, we cannot live without salt. Just something to think about. You've got water made up of really reactive atoms. You have salt made up of really reactive atoms, but when you react those really reactive atoms and you combine them and you bond them together, you get something that is very useful, but also very inert. Okay, so last thing we need to talk about is chemical bonding, and we're throwing that into the lecture because you can't talk about chemical bonding without atoms. And since we've already talked about the atomic structure, we've already talked about the subatomic particles, now let's just kind of apply our knowledge of the subatomic particles and of the atom in order to understand how atoms come together and bond. First thing we're going to talk about is an ionic bond. Notice that this is a slide that says strong bonds. Ionic bonds are actually weaker than covalent bonds, but in the whole scheme of things, ionic bonds and covalent bonds are actually pretty strong in comparison to, like, say, a weak bond like a hydrogen bond. So what does an ionic bond mean? Again, we're over here. Ionic bonds are when you have 1 or more electrons that are transferred, keyword transferred, from one atom to another, and so it therefore becomes a bond between ions. And so we can look at these diagrams, we can look at these little kind of math equations, and we can follow the atoms, we can see exactly how the ions are formed, and then how the ions attract to each other. So we have this sodium atom. This is salt. Notice from the last slide, sodium and chlorine coming together will produce NaCl, which is salt. And so sodium has, in a normal atom, 11 protons. If you counted them, there would be 11 protons. Because sodium is neutral, because this atom is neutral, there would therefore be 11 electrons as well. And so that gives us a net charge of 0. Chlorine has 17 protons in the nucleus. You can notice that the nucleus is a little bigger. It's a bigger atom. Okay, there's more shelves and orbitals to the electrons, so there therefore is more electrons. In fact, there are 17 of them. Because there are 17 protons and 17 electrons, there would be a net charge of 0 in that particular atom as well. Well, basically, without getting too technical, we know that a neutral atom isn't going to bond with a neutral atom. There's no poles there, there's no charges, there's no difference between charges. We need to have a difference between charge, and if we went into more atomic structure, we would know that an atom really doesn't want to have one rogue electron taking up an unempty orbital or an unempty shell. Okay, and so it would easily, or it would prefer, to just transfer this one electron to the empty spot of this particular atom, because this atom has one valence electron spot in order to fill up its outer shell. Okay, and so the fact that this atom needs one and this atom wants to give up one, a transfer will take place. And so this electron will be transferred to this chlorine atom, meaning the sodium atom will still have 11 protons just like it did before, but now because it transferred an electron, it only has 10 electrons. Okay? That gives you obviously a net charge of +1 because we have fewer electrons than we have protons, and if you have 11 positively charged particles and 10 negatively charged particles, you would have a difference of +1. Now that this chlorine atom has one additional electron that it didn't have before, it still has its 17 protons, but now it has 18 electrons, and the difference between the 17 positively charged particles and the 18 negatively charged particles would be a net of -1. Notice there is a negative charge on this chlorine, and there's a positive charge on this sodium ion, and the charges come from there. Okay, and so we call these ions. And the ion, by definition, is when you have a different number of electrons than you have protons, therefore resulting in a net charge, either positive or negative. And so because this one is positively charged and this one is negatively charged, now we can bond them together because of the idea that negative and positive attract, right? Opposites attract. We call that an ionic bond. On the other side, covalent bond is when you are sharing electrons. So in a covalent bond, like you see here in this water molecule, we have an atom of oxygen and we have 2 atoms of hydrogen. So atom 1, atom 2. The hydrogens have 1 electron each, and the oxygen has 8 electrons of its own. And so if we look, there are 8 electrons. The oxygen has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The hydrogen would have 1 each. You can see that here and here. And so because the hydrogen needs 1 to fill its outer energy orbital and oxygen needs 2 to fill its outer energy orbital, they share and therefore would have 10. And because they are both full at this point, they would create a covalent bond here and a covalent bond here. And so that molecule of water is held together by 2 of those really strong shared electron covalent bonds. Okay, the structure that results when atoms are joined together by covalent bonds is called a molecule, and so this water molecule is held together by covalent bonds, which is, strong in terms of bonding strength. Okay, some weaker bonds would be hydrogen bonds and van der Waals forces. Hydrogen bonds we're going to talk about a lot more in the next video when we do properties of water, so I'm not going to really go through what a hydrogen bond is, but a hydrogen bond is a weaker bond between a hydrogen atom and another molecule. You can see that this is a hydrogen atom. We will talk about this, so I'm not going to talk about it now, but there's a slightly negative or a slightly positive charge on hydrogen atoms as it pertains to a water molecule. And because they are slightly positive, they can interact and bond, form a weaker hydrogen bond with a slightly negative molecule or a slightly negative pole of a different molecule or structure or surface. So that weak interaction between a slightly negative pole and a slightly positive pole would create this hydrogen bond, which is really the biggest driving force on why water molecules can stick together. Van der Waals forces are when molecules are close together, and so there's a slight attraction that can develop between opposing charged regions. It's exactly the same properties as the hydrogen bonding. There would be a slightly different charge between 2 structures that are attracted to each other, and so they can actually stick to surfaces. And so that's why you see these geckos a lot of times that can stick to what looks like glass, is because there's a slight interaction between opposing charges between their foot and the glass. Within a living cell, many molecules interact only briefly to send signals or carry out chemical reactions or copy information from one molecule to another. And so we're going to talk about that all the way through the biology syllabus. But you will see throughout the syllabus and throughout all the videos of this year, there are several instances in which molecules come together only briefly based on opposing charge interactions. These are called van der Waals forces. That's it for this video. I'll see ya.